In this demonstration, we're going to look at ways that EPICS has so you can manage dies and keep track of every aspect of the life of your dies. So one of the first ways is using the die oven schedule. And this screen works based off of using and creating a press schedule. And once you create a press schedule, this screen automatically populates. You can see you have your press schedule date, the shift, the sequence, die, alloy, pounds, all of the information coming from your press schedule. So it's automatically created, and you can actually then print the die oven schedule so that your users can go out and locate the dies that they're going to load. When they're ready to load the dies in the oven, they may or may not need multiple copies, and you can see on the screen here, EPICS will even tell you if multiple copies are needed based on using one of the features called die run limits. Die run limits will allow you to set per hole or per copy how many pounds can be run per copy. And it's a way to establish how much metal will run through the die before the die should be replaced. So you'll know when you need multiple copies, or maybe prior to this, they want to split the lot so that you're only scheduling one die copy on a lot. And you can use the scan lots tab on the print work order screen, and they'll be highlighted in yellow showing when multiple copies of a die are going to be needed. You can set a system setting for your die run limits, or you can also set plans on die copies if they have different plans than what your system setting is. So once you determine the copies that are needed and ready to be loaded, you'll see they're highlighted green here because some of the copies are already loaded. But to simply add copies, you would just click to load the die. And this also gives information again when it's scheduled for. You will set up your die ovens, so you can have ovens set up per press with the positions so that all of the users know what positions in the ovens the dies are located, and they won't have to then fumble around in the ovens looking for what's in there. So you can select which oven you're loading, which position you're putting it into, the user, any notes you might need to add, and simply click load die. And now it's checked and it's green. You can also view the oven contents tab, which lists all of the ovens for each press and all of the information for what die copies are in the oven, what position they're located in, if the backer and bolster were there, all of the same die information when it's scheduled for. But you'll have additional information that will be set up ahead of time. And this is set up with the cycle hours. So you can set your cycle hours that tell how long a die needs to be in the oven and what the max hours are going to be so that a die will not be overheated. And EPICS will give you a color representation also to show you when dies are overdue and need to be pulled out of the oven, or you'll actually see green if it should be about ready to run based on the times that you set. And when entering production at the press, they can choose to unload a die after their production run is entered, or somebody can go back in later and manually select on the oven contents tab that you're removing a die from the oven. When you're unloading a die, you'll see also the unload time, the user, if a temperature was in there. You can also add a note. And then you'll see you have the option to save it to the die oven history. So if we unload that die, we can also then look at on the die copies, you'll notice the die oven info tab, and records will be kept for all of the heating information. So you can see historically how long dies were in the oven, when they went in, when they were unloaded. If they were extruded, you'll see the extrusion information. This die copy is still currently in the oven, so if I happen to be looking at my die copies, I can see a record of where this die copy is currently, how long it needs to cycle, and have the current status of this die being in the oven right now. So 3 of the screens that would need populated that you can do set up based on your plant are the actual dye oven screen, and this allows you to create and set up your ovens per press. So you can put your descriptions and how many positions and all of the information you need there. You will also want to set up dye oven cycles, and this is a lookup table, so you can create plans for approximately how long you want these dyes with these specific plans to be in the oven, and this will help with the color indication and letting you know when dyes are due or overdue or should be ready to run. And your dye run limit lookup table, and these plans can be created per dye copy or per hole, and this tells EPICS based on the size of the lot how many copies you're going to need based on the calculations of how you have set the plans up. And again, you can set a system setting so you don't have to worry about doing every single dye if you don't want to, and at least you'll have a starting point, but then you can go back and apply specific plans to each dye copy as you need them. So the next feature we're going to look at is the dye nitriding schedule. And this is a way for you to determine what the longevity of a dye's life should be based on the plan that you set up. And you can, with this feature, you can set a system setting, and then again, you can go back and apply specific plans to dye copies as you need to for specific plans. This screen shows you various ways you can scan for what dyes may be due for nitriding. You can look at all unscheduled copies, or you can filter and include dyes with no plan. You can show only dyes with open orders or show only active dyes. You can look at dyes that are coming up to having so many pounds until nitriding or feet until nitriding. So if I look at dye copies I have that are within 5,000 pounds or less due for nitriding, I may want to then also look at any I have with open orders, and to give me an indication of how I want to create my schedule. And to schedule these, all I have to do is simply click them and select schedule selected dyes for nitriding. And yes, I want to schedule 2. So they've now been scheduled for nitriding. On the post nitriding tab, you'll see all of my dyes here that I have scheduled for nitriding. And as I nitride them, I can simply click on them and post my nitriding. So I've selected 3 to post nitriding for, and they have been nitrided. And you'll see here, based on the copy, EPICS does show me and keep track of how many remaining feet, pounds, open feet I have, so I can make a determination on if or when I want to, when it's close to being due to nitride them, or if I need to wait, or if they're overdue. You'll see that as well. And then based on the plans that we set up, you can set up plans for how you want the nitriding to be set. So for example, my first nitriding is at 25,000 feet per hole. Then EPICS will allow maybe 1 nitriding at 40,000 feet and then the next 10 at 30,000 feet. And then that would tell me I would expect that my life of the dye will be exceeded or near the end of the life based on that. And I should also want to know that I should be able to get about this many nitridings out of a dye. So on the dye copy screen on my nitriding info tab, EPICS will keep track of all of this. So if again I'm looking at my dye copies, I can see how many times it was nitrided, and EPICS will automatically populate this so that I can see where in my plan and how many times a dye was nitrided. I can see when it was last nitrided, how many pounds or feet since, and how many pounds and feet until the next nitriding. And if it was scheduled for nitriding, I can see that also. And my nitriding plans, if I list them on the dye copies, will be listed here as well. So it's a good indication for me to see what is going on with my die copies. So the last feature we're going to look at is the die correction module, which has been out for a little while now. And this is one of the great ways that you can keep track of all of the corrections that have been performed on dies and keep a history of all of your die maintenance. So you'll have your die correction schedule, and this is populated anytime a die correction is created. They'll show up on the bottom. It works pretty similar to the other schedule screens. You'll have all of the dies, you'll create your defect codes, and that would indicate the reasons why somebody is creating a correction. When you're ready to schedule them, you'll see we have an in-house schedule and an outside schedule. So the user can make a determination when they're looking at the dies on the bottom half of the schedule, the unscheduled die corrections, on maybe they're going to be corrected in-house or maybe they need to be corrected outside by a die vendor. And so simply, if you were scheduling them in-house, you would just select which you were going to schedule. You can pick your schedule date, your shift, if you want to add a sequence. You can just simply schedule it, or you can pick which corrector needs to correct the die. So depending on what die corrections you have, you may have certain correctors that can only do certain corrections on the dies. And so then we have the whole die schedule at the top, which I can group by schedule date and shift, or I can simply, if I'm the corrector coming in, I can select my schedule and see which corrections were assigned to me. On the outside schedule, works the same way, except we have vendors. So I can make a determination that some need to go outside. I can pick a future date. Maybe my die vendors only come every so often, and I can make a schedule ahead of time. Just pick a shift 1, and I can add them to my vendors list so that when they show up for picking up my dies, we'll see on the ship and receive screen, I can see now all of the die corrections that are scheduled for outside vendors. I can pick my vendor to see which dies I have and double check that I have my list of dies ready for them to pick up. And then I can just pick my date of shipment, when I'm expecting them to return, and I can post the shipment. Oh, I have to select them. Post shipment. So those are now all outside to be at my vendor, which is a good indication for follow-up and keeping track of what's at the vendors. I can see what's at my other vendors, which dies are ready to go, which dies should be coming back, when they're supposed to be back. And if they're late, then that helps me so I can follow up and keep track of all of my dies that have left. When I'm receiving them, I can click which dies I'm receiving, and EPICS will give me the screen automatically to fill in the information for what has been done. I can add the location for where I'm going to put the die, and automatically, based on how I have my tasks set up, EPICS will change my status back to active if I have set it. Add a note if I want to. And that will then go to the next one if I've selected all in a list. And I want to update this die. And so those have now been received. And going back to the in-house schedule, when this user is posting their tasks that they're performing and correcting the dies, they simply would just go through and click on the post completed tasks, and we can mark it through caustic. I can add a new location, or I can actually, if it's not completed, I can assign a next task. maybe we need to repair a crack also. And I can pick a different die corrector and logically go in order of multiple tasks that need done, or just mark it complete if it's now finished. So one of the other great features with this is when you're looking at your die copies, so we have if you have the die correction module, you'll see the corrections tab on the die copies, and highlighted in yellow shows me I have an open correction for this die. And I can see all of the tasks that have been performed. It went out to a vendor, it came back, they repaired a hole. It originally had die lines. I can click from here to view the active die correction, and I can see all of a history of all of the tasks that have been performed on the dies. Here's another example. I have multiple die corrections over time that have been performed on this, but I can see in yellow my open correction. So if I scroll through other die corrections, I would not see any in yellow if they were completed. So here's an example. I can still see on the other tabs I've had 2 corrections. And this is a good way you can evaluate die vendors. You can keep track of different issues to see if you're having the same issues on a die. Maybe there's engineering issues that need to be tweaked, but it will give you a good history of all of the different maintenance that is being performed on your dies, and to make sure that maintenance is being performed to keep up on your die copies.